When the train screeched to a halt in the endless white, none of them believed they would survive until spring. They had not been sent to a country, they had been sent to a frozen sentence. In the darkness of December 1940, Canada felt like a verdict without appeal. Yet, the harshest stories often crumble against reality. And this time, reality turned out to be nothing like they expected. December 1940. Northern Canada. When the train doors swung open, the German prisoners stepped onto a platform that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. The air cut through their lungs like shards of ice, and the snow cracked beneath their boots, warning them with every step, only the strong survive here. Most of them had never faced a true winter. In Europe, cold was a temporary enemy. Here, it reigned as a permanent, merciless master. Rumors had reached them even before they arrived. Stories of 40° below zero temperatures, winds that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, and camps lost deep within endless forests. Canada, in their imagination, had no face, only a white void and a silence that numbed the mind. Some were convinced they had been sent not to live, but to vanish. The camp stood isolated among towering conifers, their dark silhouettes etched against a blinding white landscape. Smoke rose straight from the barracks, a sign that even the cold obeyed its own rules here. The prisoners clutched their thin blankets and stared at the Canadian guards. They expected cruelty or indifference. Instead, they found calm, experienced faces of men who knew the land and respected it. The first days tested them in every way. Boots chafed, fingers went numb, and nighttime temperatures felt like living entities, creeping toward the barracks with every gust of wind. Yet instead of shouts or punishments, instructions were given. How to layer clothing to trap heat. How to move carefully without sweating and freezing. How to listen to the wind and understand its shifts. The most surprising development came when civilians began visiting the camp: farmers, loggers, townspeople. They did not see enemies, they saw humans caught in an unfamiliar world. They taught the prisoners how to chop wood, dry gloves, and make thick soups that warmed the body more effectively than any blanket. Slowly, day by day, fear gave way to curiosity. The winter did not disappear, but it stopped being a death sentence, and that was only the beginning of a transformation none of them could have anticipated. The first real test came when the prisoners were sent outside to work. Snow stretched endlessly in every direction, a dazzling white that could blind if stared at too long. Their breaths rose in clouds, freezing instantly in the frigid air. Every movement felt heavier, as if the cold was trying to anchor them in place. At first, they stumbled, slipping on icy paths, fingers stiff as boards, and muscles screaming against the unfamiliar chill. But the Canadians watched quietly, correcting their mistakes without scolding. A burly farmer named Samuel showed one group how to chop firewood so it would burn longer in the freezing stoves. "Angle the axe this way," he instructed, swinging carefully, "or the wood splits uselessly." Prisoners marveled at how effortlessly he worked, his hands bare despite the cold that had nearly crippled them. Slowly, they mimicked his movements, realizing that the harsh winter required skill, not brute force. In the evenings, the townspeople brought lessons indoors. Loggers taught them how to read snow patterns, how to find hidden trails through dense pine forests, and how to judge ice thickness before stepping on frozen lakes. One old woman, Martha, insisted they help knead bread and prepare hearty stews, laughing at their clumsy attempts to measure flour or stir slowly enough not to spill. These simple acts of daily life, once mundane in Europe, became lifelines, showing the prisoners that survival depended on attention, patience, and respect for the land. Evenings in the barracks, which had once been filled with fear and silence, now buzzed with conversation. Prisoners spoke of their homes, of family faces they missed, and of the cold that had once seemed a monster but now felt like a teacher. Bonds began forming, not just among the prisoners themselves, but with the Canadians who visited regularly. They traded knowledge, stories, even small comforts, a warm glove, a shared loaf of bread, or a nod of understanding when the wind howled hardest. By the end of the first month, the prisoners had changed. Hands that had once trembled from frostbite could now hold an axe with confidence. Their eyes, once haunted by terror of the winter, now scanned the forests for safe paths and shelter. They began to understand that the cold was not their enemy, it was a challenge, demanding respect and patience, but offering reward in return. Most importantly, something subtle and powerful took root. A feeling that life could continue here, even in the harshest conditions. That the same winter they had dreaded could be endured, mastered, and even appreciated. It was a shift that none had anticipated when they first arrived, one that would shape not just their winter, but their futures. As the weeks passed, the prisoners began to feel something they had not expected, a strange sense of belonging. The vast white wilderness of northern Canada, once terrifying in its silence, now became a landscape full of lessons and small victories. They learned to read the tracks of foxes and rabbits in the snow, to judge the strength of a frozen river, and even to predict storms from the direction of the wind and the color of clouds. Each day brought challenges, yet each challenge built confidence. The Canadians continued to guide them, but their teaching went beyond survival skills. Samuel, the burly farmer, began taking small groups of prisoners to the forest at dawn, showing them where to find firewood that burned clean and long, how to layer their clothes to retain warmth without sweating, and how to handle the relentless northern wind. "The winter doesn't hate you," he said one morning, pointing to the icy horizon. "It just tests you. Respect it, and it will protect you." The prisoners repeated these words in their minds, feeling their fear of the cold gradually transform into a cautious respect. Even deeper connections formed in the village itself. Martha, the old woman who had taught them to bake bread, invited a few prisoners into her home on weekends. The warmth of her stove, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the simple act of helping knead dough created something more powerful than mere comfort. The prisoners shared stories of home, of lost friends and fallen comrades, of cities they would never see again. And in return, they learned stories of the Canadian land, of harsh winters survived, of lakes frozen solid enough to cross, of trees felled in perfect rhythm with nature. Laughter began to echo in the camp, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. Jokes were exchanged, small competitions held over who could stack firewood the fastest or who could identify animal tracks correctly. Respect replaced fear, curiosity replaced despair. The prisoners began to teach each other, passing on skills they had learned from the Canadians, helping the newcomers adjust to a winter that had once seemed unendurable. But it was more than just survival. Something subtle was changing in their hearts. The isolation that had once felt like punishment became a space for reflection. The endless snowfields no longer seemed like a prison, they were a canvas for learning, for patience, for discovery. For the first time, many prisoners wondered if life beyond the war might include this strange, frozen land. Some even spoke quietly among themselves of returning here after the war, of finding work in the forests or the villages that had shown them kindness when they expected cruelty. By the second month, the prisoners had begun to transform entirely, not just in skill, but in spirit. The cold was no longer an enemy to fear. It had become a teacher, a challenge, and for some, a reason to hope. And within the snow and ice, friendships had formed, respect had grown, and a new understanding of life had emerged, one that none of them could have imagined when they first arrived on that frozen platform. By the third month, December had given way to January, and yet the snow showed no sign of retreating. The German prisoners had long stopped counting days in fear. Instead, they began to notice small patterns, the way the sun barely rose above the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen fields, the way frost etched intricate designs on window panes, and how the wind could be predicted by listening to the trees. What had once seemed like an endless, merciless expanse had transformed into a landscape of learning, challenge, and unexpected beauty. The prisoner's routine had become a rhythm that balanced work, survival, and camaraderie. Mornings were spent chopping firewood, repairing fences, and hauling supplies with the guidance of Canadian farmers. Afternoons were often dedicated to learning new skills, mending clothes, tracking animals, or preparing meals for themselves and others. Evenings were filled with stories and laughter, sometimes punctuated by the haunting memory of home or the war, but more often by curiosity and admiration for a land that had seemed destined to destroy them. The Canadians continued to visit, bringing advice, supplies, and sometimes simply companionship. Their patience and quiet authority instilled a sense of trust that the prisoners had never expected to feel. It was not just survival skills that the prisoners learned. They discovered resilience in ways they could never have imagined. They learned to endure discomfort without complaint, to work together without resentment, and to observe nature with attention and respect. Simple acts, a warm bowl of soup, a dry glove, a shared laugh in the barracks, became sources of strength. The cold, which had initially felt like a predator waiting to claim them, was now understood as a partner of sorts, a force that demanded respect but could be navigated with intelligence and care. Some prisoners began to dream quietly of life beyond captivity. In the evenings, they would sit near the fire and imagine returning to these forests, to these villages, even after the war. The land that had once been a threat now held promise. They spoke of building homes near the lakes, working with their hands, and raising families in a place where snow and silence were no longer feared but understood. The thought of Canada as a potential home, something they had laughed at in disbelief on the train, slowly took root in their minds. When the war eventually ended, many prisoners were sent home, yet a remarkable number returned to Canada in the following years. Some became loggers in the forests they had once feared, others farmers in the small towns that had welcomed them, and a few even remained in the very villages that had taught them how to survive. They carried with them lessons of patience, resilience, and respect for a harsh but beautiful land. More than survival, they carried an understanding of human kindness that had transcended conflict. The winter of 1940 to 1941 had left an indelible mark, not just on their bodies, but on their spirits. What had begun as a journey into fear and isolation ended as an education in endurance, empathy, and unexpected hope. Canada, once seen as a frozen sentence, became a teacher, a refuge, and for many, a second home. The prisoners who arrived trembling in the cold left transformed, no longer just men shaped by war, but men who had learned to read the snow, listen to the wind, and find warmth in even the harshest winter. Decades later, many would speak quietly of that winter, of the people who had shown them kindness, and of a land that had given them the chance to endure and to dream. The cold had not killed them, it had changed them. And in that change, they found a part of themselves they never knew existed, the ability to survive, to hope, and to belong. These stories are rarely told. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one.